Hey everybody, and welcome back. I hope you all have been enjoying some of the new content on the channel. Definitely doing some different things and shaking it up, whether it was just checking in with Boss MTG or working on a community deck together, which has been so much fun. I hope you all have been enjoying it. But today I'm here to bring you tier list. It's been over a week since we've had these planeswalkers in the game. I took a little bit of time to get to Mythic. Haven't been grinding too hard, but definitely got in some more reps over the weekend. I've been really busy with our Discord and a few other things, but definitely feeling a bit more confident about where things are, and I wanted to share those thoughts with you. So today we're just going to go over some of the top tier planeswalkers and decks, and then we'll definitely get into the other half, likely over the next 2 days. I'll get that out to you. But for today, I definitely want to go over what I think are the three pretty strong planeswalkers, and we're going to start with Nissa. But as always, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you're thinking, what you're interested in, just what your thoughts are on the format so far. Because not a lot has changed aside from the two new planeswalkers. We haven't gotten any new cards, right? So aside from the signature cards, and which has definitely affected some stuff. I think the most appropriate thing for me is to start with Nissa. But just to kind of frame our conversation, I just wanted to put this graphic up here because I wasn't able to quite manipulate this to put it in our regular tier list. But I think we want to talk about all three of these planeswalkers in A tier. Now, I will say, since Davriel got his Last Whisper, I think that's what it's called. Actually, let me just click over so I'm not getting that wrong. Um, since Davriel got that, his draw spell reverted back to how it was intended. Um, right, Knight's Whisper. Knight's close, close. It now costs two instead of one, right? For whatever reason, the code had been counting this as a color spell, reducing its mana cost by one, which is his passive, and making you pay a total of 4 life, which you think paying 4 life to draw two cards is a bit of a drawback, but at the end of the day, what it allowed the aggro versions of the deck to do was really, really powerful. Because you're able to do it for 1 mana. Again, changing something's mana cost is a huge impact on that planeswalker, because it's just the difference of a turn is massive. And Davriel was skewing more aggressive with that kind of build where you're just dealing a ton of damage to yourself. You're digging through your deck, getting card advantage, getting your Death Shadows, and it just made him very, very powerful. Although I do think he is still very good. If I could change this graphic for you, and we're thinking about, as I've done in the past, the left planeswalker being the most consistent and most powerful, I think I would swap Garruk and Davriel. Before the hotfix, I think it was closer, but after the hotfix, I still think that Garruk and Nissa are very, very close. I still, although I've taken a huge break from playing Nissa because I did, probably 150 games last season, when I was really, really grinding it out. I do think they're close, but I do think Nissa still has just such a level of flexibility in her deck building that she is the most powerful deck. Now, people have learned to play against her. A lot of people, even when you think about Davriel playing Takedown, right? It's 2 mana, destroy a creature with 3 power or less, right? Draga Druid is one of the best cards that Nissa plays as her signature card, right? It's a 3/4 for 3, which is just a good rate already, and you're drawing a card every time you get a mana from a non-regular source. And so people are teching in different spells that really target some of her linchpin kind of early game cards that really accelerate her into the mid and late game. So I don't want to act like Nissa is as powerful as she was last patch, because the sort of cat got out of the bag at some point. I was running my builds, other people were trying different OTK builds. But I do think that, again, when we think about power, consistency, and flexibility as another axis for why a planeswalker could be really good, she is it. So just, throwing up my deck list that I had played around with, I still think that there are tweaks that can be made. And just to kind of talk about Nissa in broad strokes. So, Lava Wave, right? It's been kind of the enemy of the format for good reason, right? It's very, very hard to play around, and can be punishing if you do play around it, because then you give your opponent time to draw the Lava Wave, right? And so the magic number for a while has been 6. And so when the Titans got buffed to 7, it sort of was like, okay, Lava Wave isn't just like the end all be all. But the fact that you, as Nissa, get to play Primeval Titan, right? And like, so you can survive opposing Lava Waves and you're running Lava Wave yourself. It's still just a very, very oppressive card in a lot of ways. And I had switched some things around. I was trying Panharmonicon a little bit, and just messing with my color spell slots. And I think what I would like to at least put in here as like a real, a little bit of a deeper note on the meta is, okay, we've got Lava Wave, and we're going to talk a lot about Death's Shadow. We're not there yet, but to give you a preview, right? Death's Shadow is a 13/13 that gets discounted, right? And we'll take a look at that card. And we're seeing, I would imagine you all are seeing what I'm seeing, which is a lot of Death's Shadow. I think even black decks, including Vraska, right, are running it when they never ran it before. I think even probably Sorin players are thinking about running it. It's really interesting that Garruk and Davriel specifically, put Death's Shadow in the spotlight, and then all the other black decks were like, wait, why am I not running this card? And I will say, Death's Shadow kind of laughs in the face of Lava Wave, right? 6 damage to a 13/13 is not going to cut it, right? Which sort of inherently, if we switch over for a second, makes potentially like an OTK build a little bit stronger, because you're already kind of wanting to run cards like Day of Judgment, right? And potentially you maybe have 2 Day of Judgments in your deck to deal with Death's Shadow. So, I think this version of Nissa, although I've always really loved its consistency, and I still think it's very strong, like, Lava Wave does not pair too well against Death's Shadow. It's still a powerful card, don't get me wrong. Like, you can't sleep on Lava Wave, but I think that Death's Shadow has changed a little bit of our expectations with basically how to beat some of these more powerful black decks, which we're going to talk about next. Now, I will say what hasn't changed, and I think is really important to note, is that Pixie Trickster obviously is still very good. I felt like it was good before as a universal answer to certain things, whether it's Titans, Kothafed, stuff like that. It's still a really good answer to Death's Shadow. And potentially every Nissa deck, in my opinion, should be running either 2 Tricksters or maybe a Trickster and a Mist Raven, right? Because blue has better answers, especially in the form of Pixie Trickster, to Death's Shadow, right? You can even think about it as comboing as like Trickster turns their Death's Shadow into a 3/3, and then you get to Lava Wave it away. So this is why Nissa is still really strong, because she has these 6 color spell slots, right? You can, and her core, like the core of her deck is very strong, right? Channeler of Might's great. Birds of Paradise. Rampant Growth, it just accelerates you super, super hard. Gatstaff Agitators. Jiraga Druid. Daybreak Ranger. Primeval Titan. The core of the deck is so consistent and powerful. You can just look at the meta and be like, you know what? I need more bounce. I need more evasion. I need this kind of removal spell. I need this kind of board sweeper. That's why Nissa, to me, is still on top. Is she by far and away the best Planeswalker now? I don't think so. I still think she's probably the best option, depending on what cards you have in your collection and what you're seeing. And I think people are more accustomed to playing against her and are playing better against Nissa, which is nice. Like, she is not unbeatable. If you answer an early Jiraga Druid, and you play around maybe Daybreak Ranger or Lava Wave, where you've got some sort of board presence to deal with Behemoth if it drops down, or you've got something to push through damage even though they resolve their Primeval Titan, she's beatable. So I think it's 2 things in terms of Nissa's power level being balanced a little bit more. she's having to adjust her actual list to deal with changes in the meta that she wasn't facing before. So you really have to think about, how am I going to optimize my build? And people are accustomed to playing against her. So whether you're playing a mid-range build like this, or, just briefly to go back over, playing an OTK build like this, um, I don't think as many players are going to let you have the game. You're going to have to fight for it more, and you're going to have to deck builds even more, you know, uh, in a specific function to address specific threats. But like I said, I think she has the tools to do it kind of always. Sort of why Teferi was oppressive when we had a Teferi meta. He could just kind of run a suite of traps and just have good play against everything. And I still think Nissa, for the most part, has those kind of tools. So I don't want to spend too much time on her. I know everyone's maybe a little bit, kind of sick of Nissa, and I understand why. It's probably going to take some new cards to get there. So let's move on. I'm very excited to talk about our next two Planeswalkers, right, when we're thinking about the top tier decks. And, I'm going to give a huge, huge shout out to Tino. Just definitely a player I've really enjoyed playing with. Big person in just the general community. And they really put me on to a version of the deck that I feel like is where Garruk should be. So let me explain like where I started, right? What I had done was basically said, let's just play all the good green cards as we always do. We'll play the decent black cards. There's not too much to add, and we'll go from there, right? And so you'll look right at Primeval Titan, Overrun, Craterhoof Behemoth, and I was running this. And I think I got to Mythic with it, rattled off some pretty easy wins. But I don't, maybe this is where the deck will go in the future if we have to go bigger. But I think actually what Garruk's strength is being kind of aggressive. Like an aggressive style mid-range deck, which for those of you who know me, really reminds me of Domri, right? It's an aggressive deck that sort of masquerades as mid-range, but has a lot of ways of pressuring early, and then also has really good late game. So it is really this interesting kind of triple threat, almost. You've got early game, mid-game, late game. So this is kind of where it started. But with some playing around and really seeing the power of it, I really think that Tino is on to the more optimal build. And so let's break down Garruk a bit. I did have a gameplay video. Thank you for those who tuned in. And I'm hoping to have a Davriel gameplay video very, very soon. But that was my old version, and this is the new. And I really wanted to share this. Again, Tino also had the name, I think it was Anaconda Don't Want None. But I had to put Tino's name in here. So it's just Tino, Anaconda Don't Want. It's really just a pleasure to get to work with some really fantastic players and hear their thought processes and all that. So why would I think the question I want to share with you all is, why do I need to build Garruk aggro if he has access to some really, really good mid-range cards? Why am I playing Death Shadow? Why am I playing Silent Strike in this build? Those two cards obviously have a very nice combo to them. But, in general, why am I running Cranial Consultant, Markov's Chosen, Dark Confidant I think is more explainable, but Scorpion, Anaconda Hatchling. When I first looked at this, I was like, really? These creatures are kind of lackluster. I just want to run the best green creatures that I have. So, and I think the reason is I really, really overlooked Garruk's Predator's Instinct, right? So, to me, I was just like, oh, this passive is, pretty mediocre. Give a friendly creature +1/-1. If a creature died, okay, you get +2/-1. Which can be a nice bump, right? It can bump things up to 4 power very easily, right? That's kind of the floor. And buffing things up to 5 power, pretty easy to do after that. And I do think all of his signature cards are great. Curse Bearer, when you play with and against this deck enough, you know that when your opponent's just jamming creatures at you, the first one who kind of blocks loses, in a way, especially in the mirror match. Because you're just going to get to play a Curse Bearer. That's a 3/4 trampler for 2, and potentially snowball from there. So, this card really does change the dynamic of, blocking in the game in a way that I don't really remember the game having. Loudspeaker's Fury, although I had built, builds where you could like throw the axe on something so that you can get the free Wildspeaker's Fury, and I do think that that's an interesting strategy. I don't know if it's optimal. I think the way that Tino's build plays is that this is just a really efficient, powerful removal spell, and you're pressuring your opponent's life total. They're having to answer you. So when they resolve big threats, you're going to have a high enough life total that you just run out the Wildspeaker's Fury, and you don't have to sacrifice power to have synergy that enables the second part of this card. And then finally, as I'm sure most people have noticed, and I chuckle because I've felt really bad when I've destroyed someone's entire board with this card, literally as a, like, 1 for 3, 1 for 4. Veil Cursed Predator is a scary, scary card. It's a 5/4 that comes in. It can double fight things if they have armor and low power. This card, if you're not playing appropriately, is just going to win Garruk the game because you're already pressuring early as we'll look at the deck. And I'll try and be mindful of time because we don't have to do a too deep a dive on everything because we'll put out some more videos on that. But this card is just really, really powerful. And if you're not thinking about how this can come out on turn 4 with an empty mana gem or turn 5, watch out because this thing can just tear apart your board. Then you get to throw a big axe on someone, smack your opponent, the way is clear. So definitely the card to really look out for. So to not go too into it, I'm just going to point out some of the staple cards, and then you'll be able to kind of fill in the gaps. So Kothafed, I said this in my Vraska video, no question this should be in every black deck right now. It plays very well into Lava Wave. It plays very well with having Death Shadow in your deck because you're dealing damage to yourself. And it's just a very versatile card that not a lot of decks have the best answer to. Now, I will say, when you play against Garruk, you have to know that they can answer this potentially, right? But if they don't enable their death trigger, they're still going to pay some life to kill this. So Kothafed is an auto-include. I would say in most black decks, but I would say specifically in Garruk and Davriel, Death Shadow is just an auto-include. Especially in Davriel, we'll talk about that next. But it's just a really, really strong card that plays well into Lava Wave, as we discussed. And it basically says, whatever you're trading your life total, that's good, right? And when you're playing aggro, like, you do use your life total as a resource very, very clearly, right? Because you're trying to race, you're picking your attacks, you're picking your blocks, right? More specifically. And Death Shadow just kind of rewards you for doing that. So that's why I think it's pretty nice. And it obviously plays well with other cards that take life away from yourself, right? And Garruk has a very high life total, right? Same as Gideon, 27. So you really get a lot of room to work with when you're going to slam those Death Shadows. I think other auto-includes are Drana, and this was said really early on by Limit787, who had been playing with this card, right? 9 times out of 10, what you get to do, you get to play this card, and whether you're giving it +2, -1, or +1, -1 with Garruk's passive, it just hits them and then gets that health back from the damage that you're dealing. So the floor of this is you get to make it a 3/2, right? It attacks for 3, and then it becomes a 3/5, right? And then that's kind of hard to deal with. You can keep buffing it, and it gets bigger and bigger, and it's kind of like a mini Kothafed sometimes. Like by turn, 4 or 5 or something, or I guess 5 or 6, it's just like it's got 6 power and 7 health or something like that. So definitely a really potent threat with what Garruk is doing. You're playing all of your signature cards, no question. You want to be playing Woodland Hermitage because you just want to have more ways of drawing cards reliably, right? You're not playing Centaur, right, which I think has really come down for a lot of people, and you're just drawing your cards off your Woodland Hermitage. And we're keeping our curve pretty low to really, really maximize this land. And that's something, I've talked about a lot, that I really feel like you want to build your deck in that way so you can curve out perfectly. I would say the other kind of auto-include is Krav, right? It's a 4-mana 7/7 Trampler. It's a huge, huge body. If you play it after you've, had a creature die, right, it becomes a 9/6 next turn that it's swinging in. And you can also sacrifice something right? Or deal damage to yourself, which buffs Death Shadow. But if you sacrifice something that's basically going to die, or it's kind of useless, maybe your Infectious Scorpion or your Markov's Chosen, then you get to set up a Wild Speaker's Fury that's not going to deal you damage, right? So there's kind of an inherent synergy there. So I would say those are kind of the staples. There are a lot of different flex spots. The other card I would argue is kind of a staple is Gluttonous Goo. It's a very, very efficient card in Vraska, and it's not any different in this deck, except Goo is even almost better in this deck because it's interesting. With Vraska, they often don't want to trade with your creatures because the finale triggers, but a lot of the creatures can be kind of underpowered. I think it's better in this deck because you're applying pressure with like 3 to 5 power early creatures, and like your opponent's gonna have to trade into them, right? And also sometimes it's good for them to trade into them because maybe they're trading up on power, but that just means that every time you're gonna play your Goo, it's gonna be a 7/7 ward, and then you can give it the axe, make it even bigger, and when you're playing such efficient removal, Grudge Match, Wild Tracker, Wild Speaker Fury, and Predator, you just clear the way super easily, and it's just not unusual for you to like smack your opponent for like 11 or 13 in a turn. Sorry, my allergies are getting to me. It's been cold but rainy, and not a fun combination. So I would say those are kind of like the more clear cards to play, and you can make this build go bigger. But really, what this does with these 5/1 drops is you're able to apply pressure really early. You make Cranial Consultant into 3 power or 4 power. Same thing with Markov's Chosen, which I'm wondering even if we want to play 2, maybe shift around the numbers a bit. And then Channeler of Might, always an all-star. You can play it as a 1-mana 3/3 and not axe it, right, to attack past the X2s. But then sometimes you turn it into a 4/1 and just smack your opponent with it, trade up. And then I think Infectious Scorpion plays very, very well. Because you're going to be trading it off, and then you get Fatal Infection, which, for those of you who don't know, when Fatal Infection goes off, it happens at the start of your turn. So it turns on Wild Speaker's Fury, right? Because destroy an enemy creature. If a creature died this turn, you take no damage. And it turns on your axe, right? So you get a +2/-1 axe. Dark Confidant plays very well, as you might imagine. And then Anaconda Hatchling is just a piece of tech that I think is very, very well suited, that Tino identified. It's 2-mana 2/3. It's attacking with Death Touch, essentially, right? And that's pretty nice when you're able to still buff it into a 3, 4, 5 power creature, and your opponent's like, I don't really want to block with my Titan. I don't really want to block with my Death Shadow. And you get a lot of value. Obviously, there's also Grudge Match and Hatchling, which is just a 4-mana kill anything. So definitely worth considering. And then Wild Tracker, I've been a little iffy on this card. It was a little iffy in Domri. I kind of liked it, or still like it in a Johnny. But it actually does so much work in this deck. And I think that you can play around with the numbers here and there, but I do think that those kind of core cards for this more aggressive build make sense. And then honorable mention to Silent Strike. As you know, Tino, who played a ton of Liliana and was big pioneer of that deck, is no stranger to Silent Strike. But I am, and I really have been skeptical about having a card like this in certain decks, especially even Liliana, because if you don't have the right sequencing, it can be a really awkward card, but it is not awkward in this deck. You're applying so much pressure, and just imagine, right? You get to resolve your 7/7 Goo, you buff it with your axe, it's a 9/6, right? And then next turn, you just get to Silent Strike it, right? There's nothing they can do about that. So I think the one of kind of Miser Silent Strike is a really interesting piece of tech. And although I think it takes a little bit of getting used to, I've really come to love this build, and will probably be playing it a lot. So when we think about Garruk and Nissa, I still think Nissa is favored, but Garruk has so many ways to pressure your opponent and pressure Nissa, and you just have things like Veil Curse Predator, your Grudge Matches, your diversity of threats, your fight spells, your removal spells, and just generally powerful creatures that if Nissa kind of stumbles or doesn't have enough to gum up the board and like pad her life total, and you're answering her threats and just beating away, I do think it's a more even matchup. Now, this deck can't play around Lava Wave all that well, right? Unless you've got Krav, Gluttonous Goo on 7, Kothafed, or Death Shadow. But you do have plenty of ways to get there, and even Curse Bearer, right, if you've had it on the battlefield for quite a while, I mean, I think that's a little unlikely, could potentially survive it, and Drana could too, if you're able to buff it up. So there are ways of dealing with what Nissa is throwing at you, and I need to play the matchup more. I've been playing it quite a bit, and I believe I'm pretty much like even. So I think Nissa probably gets a bit of the nod over Garruk in general, but in the matchup, I think it's a lot closer than you would expect another mid-range deck that has no sweepers in it. Although I will say Predator is kind of a mini sweeper. So I really encourage people to give Garruk a spin. I also just generally find him to be very fun to play. That sort of like classic aggro mid-range style, which I've really loved, and I'm kind of over Nissa, so it's this deck has really resonated with me. And I do think just on power and synergy level, it just tends to be, you just do a lot of damage, pressure your opponent, you've got a lot of efficient ways to remove creatures from the board. So I think that is Garruk. I know we spent a bit of time on that. And I think the other deck that definitely stood out, although it's a little harder to evaluate, with the change, is Davriel. So I think we have to think about it in two ways. Are you playing him aggro or are you playing him mid-range? Now, I think most people are playing him aggro, and I get why, right? And obviously, Westvale Abbey has been an incredible land. I was thinking of trying other lands, but I just think the fact that this makes 2/2 lifelinks, and we'll talk about why that's particularly good in this kind of build, and the fact that you're dealing damage to yourself to guarantee Scourge's, or sorry, Paincast Demon has a 1-drop, I do think is still very strong. It obviously plays very well with Death Shadow. And, you know, a card that maybe I think people are thinking about a little bit more, with the less hyper aggro but just kind of straight aggro build, is Unstable Mutagen. Not a card I played with often, a card that was recommended to me by Karma and a few other folks in the Discord, and we've been kind of workshopping things together. We actually built this aggro deck just together this past weekend. Yeah, I think it was past Saturday. And this is what we came up with, and I was actually really happy with it, although I think it still could be more consistent. And so, really the core of the deck, as you'll see, is you're playing some really cheap, kind of efficient creatures, right? You've got Silent Prowler, Cranial Consultant, Famish Fiend, Detonator, Dark Confidant, Merchant of Death, right? All very early things, right? And Unstable Mutagen costs 2. Huge game. Huge difference, right? And the reason Abby gets even better is these 2/2 priests, right? It's just more fodder to play after you've resolved your mutagen, and then you're getting, like, you know, even if it just gets the Ember buff, right? You get a 5/2 lifelinker, and that makes it the way that Davriel really stabilizes and allows himself to close out the game is offsetting some of that life loss in the beginning of the game. Invoke the Dawn costs 1, right? Let's talk about some of the spell choices. Invoke the Dawn costs 0, is what I was trying to say. Anticipate costs 1. Very good for trying to dig to find our Death Shadows, right? Scathing Glare buffs our cheap creatures, right? And shrinks down theirs a little bit. Takedown, very efficient removal spell. Divination costs 2, right? These both cost 1. I think that Takedown is kind of an auto-include in the deck, as well as Anticipate. I don't really think that those are negotiable spots. Divination, I think, is still very good. 2 mana, draw 2 cards in this deck. Still very efficient. Davriel's Scourge can sometimes really do quite a lot of work when you've pressured your opponent early, and you're able to kind of have it sit on the board, maybe chip in for a couple attacks, and just drain your opponent a bit to offset some of that life loss. Like I said, Paincast Demon does do the work that it needs to be doing, and then you've got Unstable Mutagen buffing your whole deck. Now we get into some cards that I think could be different choices, but I'll tell you 2 cards that I think you cannot choose to change. Shell Game, I've generally liked. I just love having an unconditional kind of removal spell in the deck that plays nicely against relentless creatures. I like it. I don't know that it's the best thing to be running. I do think that Lightning Helix is also kind of an auto-include, right? It's dealing 4 damage for 3, which is a good rate, and you're taking 2 damage to play it, but then you heal 4. so you're net gaining 2 life. So it just tends to be a very efficient removal spell, and any deck that could play Lightning Helix has better game against Nissa, because the most important card to kill early is Jiraga Druid. I will keep saying it. If you're not killing that card like it is one of the best cards in their deck, you're playing against Nissa wrong. So you really need to prioritize that. But I'm going to tell you 2 cards that are just, I think, should be in every Davriel deck, in every sort of Death Shadow strategy, but especially for Davriel. Invisibility Cloak, right? Costs 3 mana, gives it Sneak and Ward. Heat Shimmer. Summon a copy of a friendly creature, give it haste and fleeting. What is important about this is when you Invisibility Cloak something, and then you Heat Shimmer it gets Ward and Sneak, right? It's not a base copy, which is what I originally thought it said. It is a full-on, whatever the upgrades are on the card, they're copied. So what is a 6 mana, essentially, like, guaranteed kill, is if you have 1 Death Shadow on the board, right, the turn previously, you go Cloak it to make it Sneak and Ward, you Heat Shimmer it, right? So this costs 6 total mana, it is more than you might have access to at certain points in the game, but it's certainly not an insurmountable amount of mana. Now, if this were full rate, 8 mana, probably not the best thing. But 6 mana, after you resolved a Death Shadow when you're sitting at like 10, 8 life, 6 life, right? You just win the game with this card combination. So I think that this needs to be in any sort of version of Davriel with Death Shadow, because obviously Davriel is the best at playing Death Shadow. And then Call the Fed, I was on the fence about, but like, it's not that hard to get to 6 mana. It is just another threat, especially with Heat Shimmer, right? You make it a 12/12, the next turn you Heat Shimmer it, or you give it Invisibility Cloak. So I actually think that it makes a ton of sense to be playing this card. I think the consistency of this deck, we're getting closer. I still think I might want to change a slot like Shell Game, potentially, maybe changing Invoke the Dawn to like some other removal spell instead of a pump spell. Although I think having 0 spells and 0 cost spells in your aggro deck that are allowing you to be more aggressive is pretty good. But who knows? Maybe Invoke the Dawn should be a shock instead, right? So we'll see. So I think that this build is good. I don't know that it's the best build. So let me just quickly show another build that I'll be working on, and I'm sure I'll be showing y'all. This is kind of what I would call like a mid-range version. So we don't have any 1-drops. We're basically just saying, okay, our 1-drop is going to be our Paintcast Demon. And I call it Cloak, Shimmer, Shadow, because I was like, that's what we're hoping to do. And again, you see Anticipate, Takedown, Divination, Unstable Mutagen, Shell Game, Cloak, Heat Shimmer, Lightning Helix, right? And then we've devoted 2 kind of late game spots to Second Sun's Dawn and Day of Judgment. I really wanted to try the wrong turn Night's Whisper package, right? So if on turn 4 you cast Night's Whisper and you draw your wrong turn, you get to play both. And I've really liked Detonator, specifically in the context of dealing with 3/3s, Channeler of Might, and of course Paintcast Demon. And Detonator is not really a downside for a deck that's really just trying to play Death Shadow. I do think that Drainblood is a nice option to offset some of the life loss. You're still running Dark Confidant, right? And then I've got kind of a Miser 1 Transparent Hallway, which sometimes is what you need if you need to be a little bit more defensive. And then I like the 1 of Flagrant Foul, 1 of Wrong Turn split. I thought about 2 wrong turns, but I think it is a little too awkward. And then Second Sun's Dawn, you're gaining life. It costs 5 mana instead of 6. I just thought that it was good enough to try. I think the jury's still out, so to speak. We're running Day of Judgment against opposing Death Shadows. And Grave Titan, for as kind of lackluster a card as it is outside of Liliana, it's still just fine, right? You just play it, you get a 7/7, you get a 2/2. If you get to attack with it, you get another 2/2. It's just a way of maybe stabilizing a little bit in the mid game while maybe you're setting up your, Cloak, Shimmer, Shadow turn, for instance. So I think the aggro build's probably a little bit better, but I kind of wanted to try, something like this. So that is a lot that I said about those 3 Planeswalkers, and specifically about Garruk and Davriel. And I think Davriel went from potentially higher tier than Nissa down to either kind of the top of B tier or the bottom of A tier. And the way that I'm kind of putting it, just to reference this again, I would say I would switch Garruk with Davriel. I think Nissa is still kind of the top dog. I think Garruk is very, very close. And I think Davriel is one of the better decks because of its versatility and because it does have that OTK with Heat Shimmer and Cloak. And I think that is like worth kind of watching out for. So let's go over to, and we will still get to a baseline deck. So if we imagine, if we go back to our actual graphic, if we imagine Nissa's here, right? Oh, sorry, I should move these down. I didn't mean to put an S tier. I still think we're figuring things out. So I really don't want to kind of send the message that, this is S tier and then there's A. So I'm just gonna put Nissa's here, Garruk is right next to him, and then there's Davriel. So just imagine that. And I do put Davriel over Vraska and Kiora and Liliana, which we'll talk about for a second, just because I do think that Davriel hasn't quite really been unlocked yet. I think we're getting closer to what is maybe the optimal build for him, and I do think that he's pretty powerful in some of the things that he can do. Does he have bad matchups? More than Garruk? Yes, and that's why he's lower down. But I'm kind of feeling that Davriel is a pretty good option, and it's going to be a matter of maybe it's a combo build, maybe it's an aggro build, maybe it's a mid-range build. I don't think we're quite there, and I think maybe when we get there, I think he sort of deserves to be in A tier. That's my thought process. So we'll definitely take this last portion a bit faster. I will show a deck, but I'm not going to break it down as much as I did for Garruk and Davriel. So I feel that Vraska has potential in this meta, and I've also not gotten to do too much with it, but I think that Vraska maybe even running Death Shadow, something we could think about, right? We could even run, sorry, I'm blanking on these names. Long Day at Work, Westvale Abbey, right? I mean, I think that's potentially worth a try. So if we go to Vraska, I'll just talk a little bit about why I really like her. And this is the community deck that we built in another video. She's running Turn to Stone, which is just an excellent card to deal with Death Shadow. Kothafed, just one of the best black cards to be playing. We've got even the Miser Silent Strike to get there sometimes. Goo is efficient. Daybreak Ranger is efficient. Krav is efficient. You've got some other static creatures that are pretty good. You've got access to Woodland Hermitage. I think Vraska just has the ability to play into a lot of decks and she has a higher life total, right, at 27 as well. I think she actually has pretty good game into Garruk. I would, for a while, was trying to say, is Vraska better than Garruk? And I don't think that's true. I do think that Vraska is a bit worse than Garruk, but I do think she's at the top of B tier because she just still has a lot of efficient tools. She really just shuts out any of the aggro decks. And I think that she really deserves some level of respect because of... I think she has the ability to just kind of, like Garruk, play very efficient card value heavy cards, and that you're able to really, push through in certain game scenarios where you get to outplay your opponent based on you drafting different cards. So I think she deserves to be at the top of B tier. I've been very, very happy with her when I've played her in the most recent season. Now, Kiora has definitely gone up for me a bit. And I'll tell you why. In a world where we're dealing with more of Death Shadow, I think Blue has a lot better answers to Death Shadow, right? You've got things like Mistraven, you've got things like Shell Game, you've got things like Pixie Trickster, and I will say this is not a terribly updated build of Kiora that Teleria had worked on, I want to say like 2 months ago. But I do think something like this can work. And I think Panharmonicon does like a crazy amount of work in this sort of deck. And so when you've got Shell Games to answer things, you're ramping, you've got Daybreak Ranger, very efficient, Momir to come up the board in the early game, Mistraven, which is really extremely good at buying you some time, and then you've got Arcanist Primal Summoning Crush of Worms to close out the game, and Prime Time ramping you. I think that she really has a lot of ways of tempoing out your opponent and having a really, really solid late game. I even found that certain Kiora builds had a pretty reasonable matchup, I felt, into Nissa. You could play double negate, right? You can, um, you've got your shell games, you're ramping as well. You've got access to other ways of card advantage, right? You're getting those Leviathans in the late game. You have ways of temporing out your opponent with Mistraven. And just kind of like going almost over the top of at least the mid-range Nissa builds, maybe not the OTKs. Um, and I just think that she is a very competitive option as a mid-range deck right now. I felt pretty decent playing into it when I was playing Garruk, so that's a little bit of a knock against her, but I think that you can probably tune the deck a little bit more to deal with what Garrick's throwing at you. So I do think that she also deserves a bit of respect. And I've bumped her up because I've kind of come down on some of our aggro compatriots and some of our old heads down here at the bottom of B tier. Um, because I just think that she's got some of the best tools to deal with what black mid-range is doing and has the ability to address what Nissa is doing if you're building your deck right. That's just kind of how I'm sort of seeing it. And Liliana, obviously I don't need to talk too much about this because the deck hasn't really changed basically at all, right? And that was true for, the fact that the patch didn't change anything. But I think the reason she's good is just like the way she works is like when she hits, she wins the game, right? When she gets her Grim Grin or when she gets the Soul Sever Silent Strike, that's it. So I think that, when you're playing against a diverse meta, sometimes the best thing to do is just to do the thing that you do well, which is I'm going to try and win the game by having a really, really good combo. I'm sure you could tune some of this deck to different things. I think the fact that you can play two negates is really nice. You're playing Anticipate for some really good card selection. Infest, I actually think, has gone up a little bit for me because sometimes you are making Davriel has cards that don't really survive it, as well as Garruk, because you're sometimes trading your toughness off for more power. So I think Infest has gone up a little bit for me. Even Drain Blood, I think, is kind of nice. To put some more respect on Tino's name, who's featured a bit in this video, which I didn't even realize. I do think that this deck is still very competitive, and I think in a meta that we're not really sure where exactly it's going yet, or what is maybe the optimal build for certain new planeswalkers, I think just do something that's kind of an old faithful. And I think Liliana is definitely, worth picking up again. Is it a deck that I personally enjoy playing? No. I would probably play some of the aggro options over her, but I do think that they're a little bit... Aggro has gone out of favor a little bit because of Death Shadow. And so we'll talk about that as we're getting towards the close. So thank you for sticking with me. And then we'll do C and D tier next time. So let's go over to Nahiri, right, and Chandra. So, forgot they're on opposite ends. So I've been really happy with this build. Hats off to Mon Man, who I think really put a ton of work into this deck last season. I played it quite a bit. It was probably my second most favorite deck to play because I found it very, very fun to play. And I think there are certain numbers you can tweak. I did a video on it and kind of why I have certain numbers. Why only one outburst and why only one Smith. And so here's why aggro has gone down for me. Garruk. Also a little bit of Davriel, but mostly Death Shadow. So I think that out of the two, and that's why I'm putting Nahiri towards the left side, right, to be most powerful, most consistent, has a bit more play against Death Shadow, right? She's got some evasive creatures. She's got ways of just hitting you in the face for 5 damage with Path of the Barbarian and Indomitable Strength. She's got some really, really explosive gameplay to her in a way that Chandra doesn't really have. So I do think if you're going to play an aggro deck in the meta that's not Davriel, you probably should be playing Nahiri. So, and then when we go over to Chandra, right, even though she can burn out your opponents, right, we've got kind of the Logan classic, haste, beat you down deck and then close things out, or you've got a version that I kind of was a bit more fond of, which is a little bit lower curve. You've got Yanogu to maybe take advantage of certain board states, Rage Runner, Takedown, Silent Prowler. And I was also trying a one-of Alchemist just as a 4-cost haste creature in red. And wasn't that disappointed with it. And then Hellrider and Lava Axe to close things out. Again, like, sometimes you're going to beat a Davriel, right, who just puts themselves way too close to dead. And I do think that matchup can be really tough, but the thing is it's just so often, at least in the games that I've been playing, whether it's Garruk or Davriel, but specifically when I was playing a lot of Davriel this weekend, it's just so easy to just resolve some Death Shadows, and the game is over. Like, your aggro opponent has no way, unless they're running specific removal, to deal with that. Should Chandra be black and running Flagrant Foul? I guess that could be an answer, right? I'm sure there are more optimal builds, but I think Chandra just, although can punish a lot of different decks, and is still a great choice for an undefined meta. I think that Nahiri's actually got more ability to deal with what, these new, switch to the wrong seat, these new Planeswalkers are doing. So I think that is definitely important to be thinking about. Now, I will say Teferi, I think, may end up kind of passing some of these aggro Planeswalkers. I think Teferi is still a pretty strong option for dealing with, and I'll throw out my kind of old school Teferi build, which I still think is very serviceable. I still think this guy's just got a lot of the tools to deal with a lot of different decks. I do think that when I've played against Teferi playing Garruk, I think you have a lot of ways to just pressure pretty heavily, and sometimes you're not able to really catch up. And Davriel, I think it's a little bit closer, right? And like, you have Day of Judgment to deal with certain things. If you're running Pixie Trickster, which I think you absolutely should be running, you've got a bit more game against Death Shadow. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a little bit more of an uptick in Teferi. As aggro has kind of fallen out of favor in my mind because of Death Shadow, that makes Teferi a bit better. So I think, and Teferi might not have to tech as much against aggro, which is what made him really strong in the first place, because aggro wasn't good enough to beat him 2 patches ago, and then you just got to tech all these really great spells for the late game. So even with the last patch, the patch before this one, 2 patches ago, even though he took a little bit of a hit on Absorb, and I think, it was the Teferi's Acolyte being a 2/4 now, I still think that he's actually a pretty great option from some of those top 5 spell slingers from 2 patches ago. And to close things out, Domri, I still think it'll get you to Mythic. I think you'll get pretty high Mythic with it, and I want to give it a shout out to Eli, or Mamba Sambo. I believe that's how you pronounce your term. Your name, Mambo Sambo, I think. So if you played against them and he competed and won, beat me in Logan's tournament, this is the build that, this is not his build. This is my kind of take on his build. Like, I threw in the Inferno Titans, and put a 1 of Tarmogoyf as well, and a 1 of Gruul Club. So I changed it a little bit. But it's still, right, you get to run Lava Wave, you get to run a Crater Hoof, Ulrich, which is just one of my favorite red-green cards. I also have definitely gone up a bit on Ember Spawn Crags, right? The Fragile Mana Gem plus your ability to ramp is still just giving you a lot of fodder for Hellrider, and for, being able to just keep a huge hand, like when I was playing against him, and pressuring your opponent. So I think that this build is definitely competitive. I still feel like my kind of classic big Domri build is still competitive. With Gaia's Cradle, I don't think you need to run 2 Treetop Lookout. I would probably shift that to a Tarmogoyf. I don't think many people are playing against that much Teferi. I mean, if you're a Logan fan and you're picking up Teferi, I guess maybe you should be playing Treetop Lookout. But so Domri has the same problem he's had. Nothing has changed about that. It's that Nissa basically does what he does better, and there's not really any reason to be playing Domri. Now, maybe Domri has a good matchup into Garruk, right? You get access to Lava Wave, you've got Crater Hoof, you've got some efficient things, you've got extra creatures and extra fodder to block what he's doing. But I'm willing to bet that Garruk is just straight up win percentage higher against Domri, but also against the field. Domri's just lost a bit of his luster, so to speak, for me because of Nissa, sadly. But I do think he's still a pretty competitive option of our remaining Planeswalkers. And so, could Vivian maybe edge him out a little bit? I think that's possible. Could maybe even Angrath or even potentially a Johnny edge him out. Potential. I would say Vivian would be my favorite to kind of trade places with Domri. But he just really, his kind of niche, which was like Garruk, has been taken over by Garruk, in my opinion, right? You get rewarded for playing aggressive cards in a shell that also can go a little bit taller and a little bit more efficient. To me, that's what Garruk does. So I think the name of the game, and as we close out to here today, are these three Planeswalkers. Again, just to be clear, so everyone knows, I would switch Garruk with Davriel. If we're going leftmost is power, consistency, flexibility. Well, let's just go with power and consistency, because flexibility, Davriel has that. I would go Nissa, Garruk, Davriel. And some people might disagree. Some people, I think, when I was talking about Davriel, were like, yeah, top of B, maybe low A, but probably top of B or middle of B tier. I've been pretty happy with the builds, and I think we're almost there with finding a more optimal build for him. But I do think that he just has some really explosive turns, almost like old Ral, where you just can set up those shadow, heat shimmer, cloak turns. And also just you can sometimes get the nut draw where you just get to go Paincast Demon into double 1-drop or 2-drop, remove your thing with Takedown, okay, draw my Death Shadow with my Anticipate. I do think that these three Planeswalkers deserve to be in the tier by themselves. As most people will probably not want to hear, Nissa is, I still think, probably the most consistent, most powerful Planeswalker. And the fact that you can oscillate between mid-range or OTK, and you can also choose to diversify your answers to deal with Death's Shadow, is definitely why I think she'll remain, one of the better decks to choose if you're really trying to get into those upper echelons of Mythic. But again, I'm really excited about Garruk. I've been playing a ton of Garruk. I just am really enjoying it, and I think that we're probably pretty close to the optimal build of Garruk, with courtesy of, Tino's been doing a ton of work. Monman's been doing a ton of work. I know he's been streaming and really innovating that. And I feel like a lot more people have been picking him up. And I had fun with him, even just playing my kind of green ramp Garruk. So if you like that, I mean, that got me to Mythic pretty easily. I went from 1,500 to 2K in a longer play session and a pretty short one. I think I'm probably at least 70% with Garruk when I was going to Mythic, so definitely worth considering. So I really feel like these three are probably going to be shaping the meta for quite some time. Until we get new cards, I guess maybe even until we get new Planeswalkers, which is crazy to say, because we've got 2 brand new ones over the last week and a half. I think they are going to be shaping the meta. And so we'll see. We'll see how things respond. We talked about Kiora as kind of this interesting dark horse that might come in and really address what some of these top 3 decks are doing. Vraska, known for her consistency and ability to kind of outplay your opponent. All 5 of those decks, I think, are really good choices right now. And if you're playing aggro, I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle. But who knows? Maybe there are pieces of tech that can really target some of these decks. It's all about the matchups, right? I've always said that, and I will continue to say it because I think that this is kind of a fun animation. So I just wanted to have this in the background as we wrap up. As I always say, it's all about matchups. If you know your matchups, it allows you to play optimally at every point in the game. right? Even if you don't know the exact build, that's why it is hard to play against Nissa. Um, if you're really tracking what can my opponent be doing at every single turn, how am I responding to it, how am I outplaying it or out pressuring it, um, you can win matchups that you're not supposed to. So I even think back to I played a Garruk game the other day against a beta player who I'd never played against, um, and they were kind of like, I don't know, it might have been a joke or whatever. They were like good gaming, like a lot. They were like making these really good plays, and I was definitely behind. But what I knew was that my build, at least from what I could tell, was a bit more well suited for the matchup. The Garruk mirror, and I just kind of kept my cool, and just had like a really good series of plays and won the game. And from that player's perspective, I think they 100% thought they were going to win. Like they really, I mean, if you looked at the board states, if you looked at certain turns, I think that was looking pretty good. But I was still considering what they could do at each turn and crafting my plays around it. And I don't think they were playing in that sort of same headspace. I was playing for the future. They were playing for, this is I'm winning now. But I was pretty sure that I could win in the future if things shook out the right way, and they did. So that's just my little soapbox motivational moment to say that games are winnable, even when your matchup is not great. If you know exactly what your opponent's probably trying to do, you can really capitalize on that level of information and know-how. So thank you so much for joining me, as always. I hope these tier lists are helpful. I'm always open for feedback. I'm really trying to get better at specifically these tier lists, because it seems like people are really finding them pretty helpful. So we're breaking it up into 2 videos. I'm going to have that second one out for you in a bit. I hope it was helpful to see some of the deck lists, and just kind of have a sense of where things are at. And I just wish you the best of luck, everyone, on your goals for this season. Hope you're having fun with some of these new spell slingers, or picking up something different that maybe is really vibing with you right now. So I will catch you later, and always until next time, take it easy.